We're doing a series on our church's purpose statement, and it was a 4-part series. If you can believe this, I'm making it a 3-part series. You thought I was going to say 5, didn't you? But I didn't say 5. You thought I was going to go 7, but see, I can shorten things. So actually we're going to go down to 3 because we want to do a special kind of one-off before the big new series starts. So 3 parts on our church purpose statement. Here it is, in case you haven't heard it before. It's on the front of your bulletin as well. To renew our city and world by demonstrating and declaring the transforming power of the gospel. And what I've been trying to emphasize to you is that although this is a church, God's purpose for the church, it is also individual. This should reflect every Christian's priorities. This is why we exist as Christians in the world. And so last week we opened the entire series with a talk about gospel renewal. We talked about how in Jesus God is working to renew all things to the way that they're supposed to be. Next week, we are going to give special focus to our city, and I want to tie our city to demonstrating the gospel. So city and demonstrating the gospel will be next week. Today, though, what I want to do is connect our world and declaring the gospel, okay? So those two. So really, I could have done it as a message on city, a message on world, one on the gospel, and one on transforming, and one declaring. So really, it's a 5-part series, but we're going to squish it down a little bit. So this week, what I want to do, what I'm aiming at this week, is to call us to join God's purpose in renewing our world by ensuring that every ethnic group hears the message of Jesus Christ, the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. So that's the focus today. So when we did our World Mission Series about 4 years ago, I know many of you were not here, we looked at this passage. I want to kind of revise that and focus it in on for where we're at now. This passage is very striking to me, and it shows us our purpose in declaring the gospel to our world. So what I want to do today is I want to develop our passage under 3 headings. I want to talk about the great sign, the great testimony, and the great imbalance. So first of all, the great sign. Now let me just set up Matthew chapter 24 before we look at our exact passage today. Matthew chapter 24 begins with Jesus telling his disciples that the temple in Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And so his disciples come to him and they ask him 2 questions. Look at verse 3. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? That's referring to the destruction of the temple. And here comes the second question. It's kind of 2-parted, but it's one question. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Then in verses 4 to 13, we're not going to really look at these today, but Jesus gives a series of signs that indicate the nearness of his coming. The nearness of that day when we talked about last week, God, through Christ, will bring an end to this sin-cursed age, when he will renew all things. What are these signs? Well, if you look through that passage, you'll see there's things like false messiahs, natural disasters, wars, the persecution of Christians, and this is a striking one, supposed Christians whose faith grows cold. That's a whole message right there. Notice in verse 8, though, I want you to zero in on verse 8, that Jesus refers to all these things as the beginning of birth pains. That's an interesting phrase. You'd think he would say the beginning of death pains. These are not good things, they're bad things, but he calls them birth pangs. Now, when a woman experiences birth pains, what it means is that something glorious is about to happen. Isn't that what it means? It's about to happen. And Jesus says, when we see these signs occurring, we are seeing the birthing of a glorious future when Christ will return and he will renew all things to the way that they're supposed to be. So these bad things are the pains which lead into that future of glory. But then in verse 14, and this is the verse I'm going to really focus in on today, Jesus gives the great sign that will signal his appearance. The great sign that this evil age and all that's wrong with it is done. The great sign that the future age is about to be born. Okay? Let's look at verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, what I want to show you here is in this single verse, we see God has a global purpose. Let's unpack this verse, and I want to ask 5 questions of it. Just quick questions, quick answers, just to make sure we really get it, okay? So, first question, what is God's purpose about? Answer, it's about the gospel of the kingdom. Look at verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom. Gospel, as we said last week, is just the Bible's word for good news. And what is the good news about? We read here, it's about the kingdom of God. And so the kingdom of God, as we took all of last week on, is the good news that in King Jesus, God is defeating all of evil. He is ridding us of our sin through Christ's death on the cross. He is going to one day destroy death and Satan, and he is going to put this world back to the way that it's supposed to be, and even better. So it's the story we've been telling, this gospel of the kingdom. That was last week, so let's move on to the second question now. How is this purpose accomplished? How is God's purpose about this gospel of the kingdom accomplished? And the answer is through declaration, or through declaring, through speaking. Look at verse 14 again. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached. Now, you often hear this word preach. You assume that means what I'm doing right now. It certainly can be that. This is preaching. But preaching just simply means to herald. A herald is someone who speaks on behalf of a king or an emperor. So the king gives a message. The herald runs to the maybe neighboring country and says, this is what the king of my country says. So it's all about speaking. And all Christians are heralds. We are heralds. We are good newsers, you might say, who come and speak the good news of this gospel of the kingdom, of all that God is doing through King Jesus to renew everything. This is why you can see right away why we said in our purpose statement, we felt it was so important that that word declaring, we could have put heralding, we could have put preaching, we could have put speaking, any of those words. We felt that was so important to be in our purpose statement because here we see that the gospel of the kingdom must be declared. People must be able to hear it to respond to it and become part of this good news in this kingdom. Third question now. Where is this gospel going to be declared? And the answer, as you can see in verse 14, is in the whole world. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world. And then he clarifies it a little bit more. As a testimony to all nations. Now, this word nations does not, in biblical language, refer to political boundaries like we would call a country. We usually synonymously mean country and nation. Biblically speaking, though, a nation is defined by things like language and culture. That's why that passage we read this morning talked about people from every tribe and nation and tongue. It can be a political boundary country, but it is more specifically things like ethnicity and culture. And so even within Canada, we might say there are different people groups. The Inuit, for instance, are very different from the Francophone people in Quebec. You might say those are different nations. We even talk about the First Nations people. And so what we're seeing here is that the whole world, Jesus says, will have this good news of the kingdom declared to them. That leads to question 4. Why will this gospel be declared to all nations before Jesus returns? Why? Why is this sign so important? The answer is as a testimony to all the nations. You see it right there in verse 14. It's going to be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations. So Jesus seems to be saying that every people group in the world, every ethnicity, every language, every tribe will have an opportunity to hear the good news of the gospel of the kingdom. They'll have an opportunity to embrace it or to reject it. And that brings us to the last question. When will this preaching to the nations be done? This declaration, when will this task be completed? And it's very obvious. You see at the end of the verse, it's when Jesus returns, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The end which Jesus, as we saw earlier, refers to his coming. So, wrapping it all up then, the great sign that Jesus is about to return is when every people group in the whole world has had a testimony, has had the declaration of the gospel given to their people group as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now, in one sense, this was fulfilled in the first few centuries as the Roman Empire, the known world at that time, heard the message through, for instance, Paul's church planting efforts. But as we know, that's not all the known world. There were other people in the world, east and west, and so the known world obviously becomes a bigger concept. So just as an aside then, we cannot say when Jesus will return. We cannot guess about this because we don't know what fully constitutes an adequate testimony. So Jesus' return could happen at any time, but on the other hand, this verse is saying it's not going to happen until the gospel's been preached to all nations. We, therefore, just go about our task. We leave it up to God to decide what constitutes an adequate testimony. But here's what we know for sure. God's purpose for the entire time between Jesus' first coming and his second coming is that the transforming power of the gospel be declared amongst all the nations. So you should see really obviously why we wanted in our purpose statement to say that we want to seek the renewal in our world, not just our city, in our world. And we said this is done by demonstrating and declaring the transforming power of the gospel. Straight out of verses like this one. This, friends, is the great sign. Now, in the second heading, I want to talk about the great testimony. And here I want to accomplish the impossible. In 15 minutes, what I want to do is to tell us the story of how God has already been doing this since the time of Christ, right up to present day. And I promise 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to do all that. So it's going to be a poor job, really, is what I'm trying to tell you. But I hope to capture our hearts, to stir up in us to say, wow, God has a global purpose which had begun way back with Christ. Well, actually, way before that, but I'm just talking about Christ's commission now. And it's gone on for 2,000 years, and we are part of that story. So what I want to do is I want to break down the history of the last 2,000 years into 5 eras of 400 years each. We'll track it that way, okay? The first era is from the time Christ went back, ascended up to heaven, to 400 AD. This era I'm going to talk about as the gospel testimony to the Roman Empire. Now, of course, this is an astounding time in history. Have you ever just contemplated how amazing it is that this no-name peasant teacher from Galilee and his kind of 12 no-name friends of no significant influence, money, or power, within just like a couple generations, shake the foundations of the Roman Empire? That is an astounding sociological movement. Just sociologically, that is astounding. By 212 AD, Christianity had gone as far north as England. By the year 250, 50% of the people in the empire were Christian, and by 375 AD, the emperor himself said that he had become a Christian and he made Christianity the official religion of the empire. That is a big change from Christ starting out his ministry in Galilee. From the manger in Bethlehem to Caesar's palace in Rome in 350 years. So here's a map, for instance, of the Roman Empire. And you can just see on this map how broadly it is spent. So, of course, here is where Jesus grows up. Here is where Christianity spreads within the first 300 years. And that's basically, at that time, the known world in the West. That's an astounding thing. Now, the question I just want to put quickly is, what did God use to spread the testimony? How did this happen? There's actually a lot of answers to it, but right now I just want to simply bring up two. The first is that God used persecution. Yeah, persecution. Throughout the book of Acts, for instance, we see it right in Acts 2, 3, and 4. The Christians were supposed to go to the ends of the earth with the gospel. They didn't. They stuck within their own circles. Persecution forced them outward, and as they went, there's this great phrase in Acts, I think it's Acts 8, where they went and they gossiped the gospel wherever they went. So persecution forced them out. But the first 300 years, if you know your church history, it is a story that is just soaked in blood, as Christians are killed everywhere for their faith. But Tertullian, one of the great early Christian leaders, said, "The more you mow us down, the more numerous we grow. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And that's exactly what happened. The more Christians got killed, the more people came to Christ. The other thing that God used, and I'd like to remind you of this constantly. I think I did this quote maybe 5 months ago. And I'm going to just use this quote all the time because it's so great. It's a historical quote from the historian Kenneth Scott Latourette, simply showing that God used ordinary people. Latourette writes, "The chief agents in the expansion of Christianity appear not to have been those who made it a profession," that's like me, "or made it a major part of their occupation, but men and women who carried on their livelihood in some purely secular manner and spoke of their faith to those they met in this natural fashion." That's the first era. That brings us to the second era, which I'm going to quote from 400 to 800 AD. Here we see how the gospel was declared as a testimony to what were then called, and today we still usually in history refer to them as the barbarians. And although the Roman Empire largely was won to Christ, the Christians did not take the gospel north. You saw on that previous slide, there's a lot of land north, and there were a lot of people up there. So anybody here Anglo-Saxon? Yeah, Anglo-Saxons. All right. Me too. All right. We're the barbarians. I kind of like that, actually. It's kind of fun. We're the barbarian people. These are the tribes of the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Anglo-Saxons. But God would ensure that the barbarian nations received the gospel. How did it happen? Well, the barbarians invaded the Roman Empire. So here's a map, for instance. You can see these are kind of all the tracks of here's all the different kind of the tribes, if you want to call them that, the barbarian nations. And you can see how they are invading all over. And notice where where they're going towards Rome. So by 410, they had sacked Rome itself. And you know, and back in these days, the Christians thought when Rome fell, they thought this is the worst thing that's ever happened to Christianity. I mean, Augustine wrote the famous book, The City of God, as a response to all the Christians who were just like, the whole world is collapsing. Everything's gone now. This is the worst thing in history. But this was not the case. Because you see, as the barbarians took over, they were won to the faith of those whom they took over. So, missiologist, that's a guy who's a professional guy in world missions, Ralph Winter, he writes this: "The indisputable fact is that while the Romans lost half of their empire, the barbarian world, in a very dramatic sense, gained a Christian faith." God works in mysterious ways. In this era is also when we have this amazing story of how the Irish received the testimony of the gospel. Any Irish people? All right, yes, we got Frank at the back. Yay. Well, the Irish back in those days, clearly not in our days with Frank, were brutal warriors. They would take their boats over to England and they would capture English people, and they would take them back as their slaves. And on one of these slave-capturing trips, they took a young Christian teenage boy, and they turned him into a shepherd. This boy learned the language. He learned the culture. He eventually actually escaped, and he fled down to France. While he was in France, God really got a hold of him, and he actually says he had a dream in which Irish children were calling to him and saying, "Bring the good news back to Ireland." His years in slavery had prepared him to understand the Irish people, to understand Irish culture and language and all these type of things. And so he went back and he preached the gospel amongst them. Listen to this. By the end of his life, there were 300 churches in Ireland, 3,000 trained pastors, and about 120,000 baptized Christians. Do you know who I'm talking about? St. Patrick. He's not a leprechaun, okay? Yes, we have a day every year, and people think it's about turning green and a leprechaun. St. Patrick is one of the greatest missionaries of all time. Let's move on to the next era, from 800 to 1200 AD. This is the testimony of the gospel to the northern Scandinavian people who were called the Vikings. So any northern Scandinavian people here? All right, we got a bunch. Where's Madeline? I need some representation. Dave on behalf of Madeline. Once again, speaking generally, the Christians of Europe did not take the gospel out of their comfort zone. They did not go up to the northern Scandinavian nations. But God would ensure that the Vikings heard the good news. And it happened in much the same way as the barbarians. So the Vikings invaded Europe, but they didn't invade it kind of with land armies. They invaded it on river ships. So they went down the rivers through Europe, and imagine living in Paris and 40,000 Vikings suddenly come down the Seine River. You are in big trouble. And the Vikings, they were also a very brutal people. But once more, the gospel conquered the hearts of the conquerors. It happened in all kinds of ways, but for instance, monks would be forced to educate Viking masters, and they would teach them the gospel. They would become Christians. Young women, Christian women, were forced to marry Viking men, and they would then share, or they would have to be forced to be mistresses. They would then also share the gospel. And the Viking people, the Scandinavian people, came to Christ in droves. So do you see the story so far? I mean, Jesus promised that the gospel would be declared as a testimony to all the nations. And if God's people will not go to the nations, then God will find ways to bring the nations to God's people. He will ensure that everyone gets a chance to hear this good news. Well, let's move to the next era. This is from 1200 to 1600 AD. This area does have some positive stories, but I actually want in this era to talk about some of the missed opportunities. First, there was, of course, a colossal missed opportunity with the Muslims. This is the era of the Crusades, something that to this day still causes a great rift between the supposed Christian nations and the Muslim world. But this is also the era of the greatest missed opportunity in history. This is what most missiologists say, not just me. In the beginning of the 13th century, a great warrior rises up in Mongolia. By the age of 34, he rules over 2 million people. His empire was, and still is to this day, the largest geographic empire in the history of the world. It stretched all the way from China, so if you're from China here today, this involves you, to India, to Eastern Europe. So all of Asia is basically included within his empire. Do you know who he is? Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan had a grandson named Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan had a wife who was a Christian, and she was wanting to tell her husband about Christ, and so he was kind of interested in learning more. Kublai Khan sent 2 men with Marco Polo's, the 2 uncles of Marco Polo actually, back to Europe with this message, quote, that 100 persons of our Christian faith, able clearly to prove by force of argument to idolaters and other kinds of folk that the law of Christ was best, and that all other religions were false and not, and that if they would prove this, the Khan and all under him would become Christians and the church's liegemen. The conversion of Asia seemed at hand. But the Pope could only find 2 men who were willing to go. They set out with Marco Polo, but the journey was so harrowing, so frightening, that the 2 men turned back. Kublai Khan never received his 100 missionaries. And one of the greatest opportunities for Christ in the history of the world was lost. Even up to this last century, when Mongolia was under the Soviet Union, it was really considered to be one of the prototypical communist, strictly speaking, as atheistic states. It was said that there could not be found one Christian in all of Mongolia. That's changing. I was listening to some missionaries named Brian and Louisa Hogan. And God has used them and their team to start 300 churches in Mongolia. And this Mongol church now has a vision to win back the entire Mongol Empire for Christ. And they're beginning to do it. So if you're Chinese, if you're Asian in any way, this is how the gospel of that testimony has come, did not come, but is beginning. And now I want to get into more of the Asian story in the last era. The last era, of course, is from 1600 AD to the present. This is what I'll simply call the testimony to the ends of the earth. And so much could be said here. I mean, there's entire courses just on this section of history. But for all the good of the Reformation, Christians for the next 250 years considered the Great Commission to go to the ends of the earth as something that was for the apostles and not for the average Christian. But in 1792, God raised up a man named William Carey. He wrote a famous pamphlet on the Great Commission saying, no, this is for all Christians to go to the ends of the earth, to all nations. He famously went to India, and of course he made that famous statement as well that we should listen to this as a church, and this I believe is what's behind what we're trying to do right now, to expect great things from God and to attempt great things for God. That is a man of faith, and that is what we are trying to do as a church right now. Thus began what's called the Protestant mission movement. The gospel moved out from Europe, from North America, and it started to go out to the ends of the earth. Here you have, of course, the great stories of Hudson Taylor going to China, John Patton, who he quoted a few weeks ago, to the New Hebrides. You've, of course, got Adoniram Judson to Burma. And as a result of this movement, there has been really a global shift in Christianity. So great that it's never been seen in 1,000 years. No longer is the center of Christianity in the Western and Northern nations, as you can clearly see it was at one time. Most Christians, listen to this, most Christians today live outside of North America and Europe. In 1900, there were 8 million Christians living in Africa south of the Sahara. Today, there are 335 million Christians in Africa. We got some Africans raising a witness? Protestants in China grew from 1 million to over 80 million in less than 50 years. Any Chinese people here today? We've got quite a few of those. Christianity has moved south, and it has moved east. Which way are we going right now? East. I can remember where I'm standing. That's right, that way. Philip Jensen then writes this: if you want to visualize a typical contemporary Christian, you should think of a woman living in a village in Nigeria or in a Brazilian slum. That is the typical global Christian today. So does this excite you? I mean, Jesus said the gospel would be declared as a testimony to all the nations. It was preached to the Romans. It was preached to the barbarians, to the Vikings. And in the last 250 years, really, it has gone to the ends of the earth. So do you realize what generation we live in then? We live in a generation that could very well see the completion of the great sign, which means the return of our Lord and the renewal of all things. So that is the extremely short version of how God is ensuring that the gospel be given as a testimony to all nations. We looked at the great sign. We looked at the great testimony. Now in the final place, I want to talk about the great imbalance. And here's what I want to do in this final point. I want to impress on you the task that is still remaining. I want to show you a PowerPoint slide. There's a lot on it, so let me just walk you through it. The pie chart here is meant to do two things. The first thing it's meant to do is to divide the world into what we call the reached and the unreached. This black line is meant to divide the reached from the unreached. Let me just define those terms. I'll keep explaining the slide so you don't have to look it all over right now. By reached, what we mean is simply that a people group has a testimony of the gospel amongst them within their own culture. So Canadians, for instance, I'm not sure how we define Canada, actually. Probably should have looked this up this week. I'm not sure if Canada is defined as one people group. I'm guessing no, because of Inuit, First Nations, Francophone. Let's just say there's 4, including more English-speaking for now. Canada is considered, though, by missiologists to be a reached people group because anyone can have access to the good news of Jesus Christ. Unreached, on the other hand, then means that people have no testimony of the gospel available to them. So this pie graph, this is from 2008, unfortunately a little bit old, but what you can see here, what's so encouraging about this, is that 60%, this is 60% of the graph here is, that's actually higher than 60, isn't it? That's almost 70. We're at 70. Maybe this is more updated. 70% of the world in this graph is considered to be reached, with 30%, well, 32% considered to be unreached. That, you got to realize something here. That is a huge change from the last major census, which was 1976. In 1976, 40% of the world was considered reached. So from 40 to almost 70% in 38 years. I know it's 38 years because I was born in 76. That's amazing. That shows Christians are taking seriously the call to go to the ends of the earth. What a change since 76. To translate that into people groups, you can see there are considered to be 24,000, if you add them up. 24,000 people groups in the world. 14,000 people groups are considered to be reached, with 10,000 considered to be an unreached. So obviously that's not just the populations, but the actual people groups considered as one. So praise God for this global testimony of the gospel. But the second thing that I want you to see on this pie chart, what this pie chart is meant to show you, is where the mission force is focusing its efforts. Here's the big question I have. Where do you think the bulk of the world mission force is working? Amongst the reached people groups or the unreached people groups? Are you ready for this? Maybe you already saw it on there. 90%. Where are we? Right here. Over 90% of missionaries work within the reached people groups. 90%. Over 9 out of 10 missionaries are working with people who already have a testimony of the gospel. That means less than 1 out of every 10 missionaries are working with the 10,000 unreached people groups. Now, do we need missionaries amongst the reached people groups? Absolutely we do. Let's not downplay that at all. Of course we do. I mean, if we don't, why are any of you here today? I mean, there's still more people who need to become Christians. The church needs to be strengthened and matured. So yes, we do need that. But listen now. Since Jesus told us to take the gospel to all nations, all people groups, is there not a great imbalance when over 90% of the mission force is focused on reached people groups? This is what the missiologists call the great imbalance. So what I want to just ask today is God putting it on any of your hearts to go to an unreached people group? I don't know. Maybe there's 1 or 2. I've got to ask that question. Maybe 1 or 2 of us would say, I will go to an unreached people group. Let's start a discussion about that. But God may not be calling you to go to an unreached people group, or maybe even to a different country. But listen, friends, this is how I'm wrapping all this up. We are all called to be part of God's global purpose to ensure that every tribe and nation and tongue receives this testimony of the good news. We're all called to that. And so as a church, we want to take that seriously. And so as a church, if it was a few years ago now, we made some choices on missionaries we wanted to work with. And we chose the major missionaries that we want to support are Raj and Kim Vanadale. Now, Raj and Kim work with some reached people. They're trying to raise up leaders amongst some reached people groups. but they are also working among unreached people groups. And so I emailed Raj this week and I said, hey, can you just give me a better picture of what's going on amongst these unreached, just so I can encourage our people to pray for you and for what's going on. So he sent me an email and he said it's very complicated in India to define reached and unreached. I think it's largely because of the caste system, because society is so segregated. You can literally be living next to people and they're considered unreached and you're considered reached because they have no access to the gospel because they can't go in your circles. I think that's what he means. And so he sent me an email, and I'll read you part of it, and he gave me 3 quick little stories of unreached people groups, of people that he's already talking with. Remember, they only got there like 2 months ago. Our landlord, who rented his house for us, they are high-caste Hindus and a multimillionaire as well. In order to keep their family business and money, they marry their own niece. They are an unreached people group. He earns about $20,000 a month. Our taxi driver, who I became friends with, he is Badugu tribe, and he says that's like the First Nations community in Canada. They don't allow any other people to live in their village, and they are strong Hindus. If anyone comes to know Christ, they will kick them out of their community, also ban them from associating with anyone in their village, including their own family members. He has invited us for a function in his community already. This is an unreached people group. Our neighbor near to our home village, very poor people, but very nice people as well. They are also Hindus, but lower caste Hindus. I have been to their house a few times to have a cup of tea, and they were in our place a few times as well. They are scared of their Hindu god and goddesses. They believe they are poor because it is their destiny and fate. They cannot do anything to change their life. They earn about $10 a day. And then he told me that recently they had a huge tragedy in this family because their one cow died. So Raj then he says, this is another unreached people group. Raj then puts a little thing in his email, and he says, I'm hoping to be able to buy them a cow sometime. So I emailed him back and said, how much does a cow cost? I don't really have a clue. He just emailed me back this morning, and he said a cow costs $250 to $300. So I say we do it. Is that a no-brainer for you? I haven't even talked to any of the other pastors about this. I don't think I really need to. We could take this out of our benevolent fund, which you give for people in need. We could take it out of our outreach funds. We say to Raj, here's $300. Go buy that guy the nicest cow you can find. And this is our way of trying to demonstrate the renewing power of the gospel, to renew that man's little life, and perhaps that will give Raj an opportunity to then speak the gospel. This is one of the great things about being part of a church. Because if you think to yourself, how can I reach the unreached people groups? Well, for the large part, you can't. But when you're part of a church, for instance, you give, and a portion of your dollar goes to help support Raj and Kim. We're here talking about it. I want us to pray about it. We can give towards it. So, friends, this is why as a church, what I'm trying to do this morning is just simply say this. We want to be a church that is on board with the global purpose of God. We don't want to be a church that is so just us-centric. We don't even want to just be city-centric. We want to be global-minded. We want to be on board with God's purpose because God has been working since the beginning of time, since the fall of Adam and Eve, to restore back a people to himself, to bless through Abraham's seed all the nations of the world, sent Christ to die for people from every tribe and nation and tongue, and he calls us to bear witness to all the nations to the end of the earth, and then the end will come. I want the end to come. I want the renewal of all things. So as a church, let's be on board with this global purpose. Again, I would encourage you to email Raj and Kim occasionally. Maybe don't ask them big questions so they have to write you huge emails back so their time is respected. But just say, hey, we're praying for you. We're encouraging you. Let's be people who are encouraging these specific missionaries as they go about their work. Our purpose is to renew our city and our world by demonstrating and declaring the transforming power of the gospel. Let's pray.